when we die, could our spirit live on, perhaps even confined to a particular location? Today we explore the spirits that have been left behind, confined to a house they once knew. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Number 1. There was a small door that led to an attic space in my bedroom when I was 11 years old, and it became habit that I would shut the door as I walked into my bedroom a couple of times a week. I didn't think anything of it. I just assumed my mother didn't close it all the way and that she left it. After a while, I made the mistake of joking with her when she made a comment about me not picking up after myself. I said something like, "Every night, I have to close the attic door behind you. How about you shut it all the way when you're done?" She then informed me that she hadn't been in the attic in months. I asked my brother, and his response was the same, as well as my father. So then I started to pay really close attention to it, making sure it was closed in the morning, checking it after school, checking after dinner, as well as when I was heading up to bed. And without fail, at some point, it would be open. After a couple of months of wandering, studying, and experimenting, I thought I'd see what happens if I just don't shut it. I opened the door before school and checked it after school. It was still open. I checked after dinner. Still open. Before bed, it was still open. Now I'm laying in bed with my mind going crazy with the open door across the room. So I decide to check it out. So I roll over and focus on the black space in the attic, only to see a face staring back at me. I bolt downstairs, wake my parents, and get ridiculed by my brother. We switch bedrooms. We ended up moving into a new house 6 months later, due to an expanding household, and my new physics teacher and his wife bought our house. I could have forgotten all about that event and chalked it up to me having an overactive imagination. But then my senior year, I discovered how awesome our physics teacher was. It became my favourite class by far, and he was my favourite teacher. At the end of my senior year, my friend and I took our VHS camcorder around town, doing mostly silly things, but then took it to my old house to see what they'd done with the place. We got a very fun tour, and I got to tell stories about all the projects my dad did that were still part of the house. Then the wife leads us upstairs to show us the sewing room. I ask jokingly, "Notice anything strange in this room?" And I kid you not, her face goes blank. On camera, she asks what I mean, and I try to shrug it off, but end up saying something about the attic door. She confirmed that every time she comes up to sew, the attic door is open. She then tells us that the second day of being in the house, her dog, a German Shepherd, had gone into the room, but would not go back downstairs. He started barking and could not be consoled, and then jumped through the window, landing on the tin roof over the porch, and then running off. The dog did not come back until the next day, and has not stepped foot into the hallway that leads upstairs since. I had the initial thought that I could show my parents and brother the story I had filmed, but I just decided to let it be. Number 2. I was just a kid of 9 years old and I certainly didn't believe in ghosts. I was raised in a strictly Christian household, and the closest thing to ghosts that my family believed in was demons. And it was a brand new house, just built, never lived in a brand new development. We moved in on Halloween night. It started out like the sort of things that you could explain away. Loud creaks, doors slamming by themselves, sudden drafts that didn't seem to have a source. Things you would expect in an old cliched horror house, sure, but not a new one like ours. Then, I was home alone all day, sitting at the family computer. A single footstep sounded down the hall, and then a few more, gradually getting closer. I assumed that my parents had come home, or my sister, or anyone, and I called out, but there was nothing. I grabbed the phone and ran over to our basement. After I called my mother, she confirmed that everyone was out and that no one was supposed to be in the house but me. I convinced her that I must have imagined it, but I swear those footsteps were as plain as day. None of these things compare, though, to our basement. My younger sister and I played there, but unfinished levels had some faulty lighting, and the lights often flickered or went out. Whenever they did, we'd run upstairs quickly, but never without catching a glimpse of the man we called the Trenchcoat Man. A tall, shadowy man in what appeared to be a trenchcoat and hat, ducking behind some unfinished sheetrock. There were more stories. Friends who, unprompted, mentioned a similar-looking figure in the basement. One crisis involving a girl taped in a cabinet, and other things. But I was constantly trying to convince myself that I was only imagining it. I was a highly logical child. Everything to me had to be maths or science, and ghostly activities sounded like something my eyes invented or my brain mistook. My parents, Christian as they were uncomfortable when I brought it up, and as I got older, I tried to forget about it. Even now, more than a decade later though, I can remember it with perfect clarity, and my most vivid example of ghostly activity. I'd gone to fetch something from our basement, retrieved it, turned around, and walked towards the stairs, which were located next to a pile of junk, an old microwave, some books, and other things. The instant I turned around, I saw her. A woman with beautiful, shiny, long golden hair, sitting cross-legged atop our old microwave. She was smiling, looking at the opposite direction, and running her fingers through her hair. She was completely transparent. I stopped completely and stared. I blinked. I pressed my fingers on my eyes until I saw those flashing lights. I tilted my head to other angles, but alas, she was real. She was still there looking out our basement window, near the ceiling and flipping her hair. I could even read, through her, the piece of construction paper I'd taped up on the wall on the other side of her body. Whenever I look back on those memories and I think that I just must have been an imaginative kid, I remember that woman, and I realize that there absolutely had to be something I just couldn't explain. Number 3. My father and I recently got back in touch, and I have moved back in with him. And I have been experiencing, for lack of a better word, a kind of presence in his house. It has been growing more and more powerful. First, just a slight feeling of being watched, to noises and objects being moved around the house. And now, I am unable to sleep. I originally moved back in using my brother's old room, as he had moved out a while ago. I always got horrible feelings in that room that never allowed me to fall asleep. I eventually just got another room, and the feelings more or less subsided. This had all started and escalated within the past 2 or 3 weeks. But I am no stranger to paranoia, and living in this giant log cabin in the woods, it would have certainly been possible to write it off as just nerves from a creepy house. I honestly started believing that I was starting to go crazy. But with these events growing in such strength and history, I now believe if there really were spirits in this house, there is more than one. Anyway, it started out with me surfing Reddit one night. Out of nowhere, I get this nasty feeling that someone is in the room. I can't really describe it, just an unwelcome feeling. At the same time, the objects in our living room started violently shaking, just for a second. The TV, the couch, the racks of DVDs, everything in that confined area just started rattling. There was a big bang, and it all stopped. That was the first night. Over the next few nights, things started to escalate. I started feeling as if I were being watched, like someone was standing over by the table. Still, a very unwelcome feeling, as if at any moment someone would jump out and come after me. Eventually this feeling worsened, and after a couple of weeks, I was feeling it every second I was in that house. The noises grew as well, or feel the vibrations of thudding feet throughout the house in the middle of the night. They started in the back area where the TV and memorial sections of the house were, eventually branching out to the whole main floor. After another week or so, I realized that footsteps were following me around the house. One memorable night, I was working on homework, and the footsteps walked right up to me and stopped. I wigged out a little and decided to call it an early night. I went upstairs to my room, and the thudding footsteps continued downstairs. Then I heard them going up the stairs and into my room. It walked right over to the edge of my bed and stopped. I didn't sleep that night either. This was back before I moved into the good room, and one of the tipping points that made me move out again. It always seemed to be when I was by myself that the activity really kicked off. My father and stepmother went out of town one weekend, and that whole weekend was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I'd be sitting at the computer, playing RuneScape or something, perhaps petting my cat, and suddenly we heard a loud slide and a bang from the memorial section of the house, full of antique furniture and belongings that we'd inherited from recently deceased loved ones. The cat started freaking out, and we went to investigate. I found an old antique candle holder lying sideways on the top of the bookshelf. I don't know how it got there. I called my sister and her boyfriend over. We got drunk and played games, and all was well. So it all kind of kicked off one night when I had to pick up my stepmother from a concert. She got very drunk, and she tends to reveal some pretty personal stuff when she drinks. She went home, and suddenly she completely broke down to me and started telling me all of the paranormal experiences that had been happening to her. Really out of the blue moment. We entered the house, and she just broke down and started talking about how this house was a portal. She described the evil presences that I've been feeling as, well, sometimes it would be so powerful that she would be afraid to move. She would not leave her bedroom without my father by her side. She also explained the temporary visitations of her recently deceased mother and brother, who would only stop by to let her know that everything was okay and not to worry about them. It turns out that before I moved in, she got so wigged out by the bad presence that she walked out to the main road and screamed to leave her alone. It immediately stopped, but then I moved in, and that's when I started to experience the same phenomenon. So after some talking, we decided to split the cost for an EVP recorder, which I still need to pay my half for. It took about 2 or 3 weeks to arrive, and right after we decided to order it, the shit went up to 11. I was never able to sleep on the days that I stayed in there. The cat was constantly freaking out, always felt followed. I heard tapping on the windows at night and in the morning, and the very night before the EVP recorder finally arrived, I started seeing apparitions. I'd get a feeling of someone watching me from a specific area in the house, and when I turned to look, I'd see the shadows start to move by themselves. I fell asleep on the couch that night, as I had become accustomed to, and in the glass door, I'd see the reflection of a full silhouette of a man walking around the room. I couldn't actually see anything in the room, but his reflection was there. I was making ramen the other day. Earlier, I tried after my stepmother, and she had demanded that any spirits in the house stop messing around and just show themselves, and evil spirits were not welcome. As I was about to add the chicken flavor to the noodles, the cat was walking in front of me and suddenly stopped, looked up at some spot right behind me, and simultaneously, I felt a feeling of pure terror, and the cat suddenly reared up, arching its back and puffing out its fur with its tail out. The standard frightened cat pose. But even the cat's eye got wider, and he dropped his jaw. It looked like the cat was trying to scream, as silly as it sounds. I've never seen a cat with such a human-like expression on its face. I didn't even know that they could make that expression. But as it was staring right behind me, I've never seen a cat so terrified, and I'm not sure I've ever felt such fear either. All I can remember is believing I was about to be violently attacked, but the feeling passed as quickly as it came. The cat went back to normal, as he and I were just stuck in an extremely confused look. The cat was antsy for a while after that, and there was a loud bang near the memorial section of the house, and there's been nothing since then. Number 4. My girlfriend and I moved into an apartment complex, a bunch of fourplex. Not too long after we moved in, we got our first dog. All was well for a few weeks. After about a month of having the dog, I was walking her outside, and a little kid walks up to us, around 7 years old, and he said his name was Owen, and he asks if he can pet the dog. Of course, I didn't think anything of it and said yes, and then he asks if he can hold her. I figured why not. Owen then picked up the dog, squeezed her as hard as he could, instantly causing the dog to squeal. I told him that was not okay, and that he shouldn't treat animals like that. I know this is not scary yet, but bear with me. A couple of days later, whilst I am home, I hear a knock at the door. It's Owen. He asks if the puppy can come out to play, and I tell him that she is sleeping, and then he asks for candy. We keep a bowl of candy on the coffee table in plain sight. I say sure, but make sure it's okay with his mother before he comes back. This happens 3 or 4 more times over the next few weeks. Around lunchtime one day, Owen shows up, and he asks for candy whilst holding up a yellow wiffle bat. I tell him that I'm all out of candy and that he should go home, and he responds, "You best have candy when I'm back, or we are going to get you." He was alone. I closed the door and moved the bowl of candy to the next room out of sight. In about 15 minutes, I hear the door open and the storm door slam shut. Owen, without missing a beat, walks in, takes candy as if he knew where I moved the bowl to, says nothing and then leaves. I chase him out and tell him not to come back and proceed to ask him where he lives. He points to his place, and I make a mental note to go down there at a later time with my wife, because she wears the pants in our relationship. When the missus gets home, we both walk down to the apartment that I watched Owen enter into, and no one's there. It's empty. According to the office, the unit had been empty for some time, and any tenant would only stay for a few months before breaking their contract. Over the next few weeks, the dog and cat go nuts. The dog would sit and growl at the corner behind the front door. For hours, she would watch the corner. The cat would go shit crazy if the doors were shut, scratching at them, shoving his face trying to get them open. About 2 months after the initial sighting of Owen, my wife and I are driving home late at about 11. About 2 months after the initial Owen sighting, my wife and I are driving home at about 11 p.m. So we turn the corner and Owen is there on a big wheel and stares right at us. He points at us and follows us with his finger as we turn around, park the car, and he's gone. Since then we have moved to a new location, but for the year that we lived in the apartment, the dog and the cat never stopped hating doors and corners. We often heard creaking doors and saw reflections in the windows. I'm getting goosebumps just remembering it. By far the creepiest experience I've ever had. Number 5. I am a single mother of 5 sons, who are now adults. While they were teenagers, we lived in a century home. Beautiful and large with plenty of room for my brood. I should mention, our house was the house that all their friends congregated to. There were rarely nights on weekends and summers that we had less than 6 teenage occupants. I tell you this to try to make you understand that these stories I'm about to tell you are truth and corroborated by many people. When we first moved in, everything was nice and quiet for a few months. Then slowly, activity progressed. My sons and I were all having unexplained happenings. They didn't tell me for almost a year because they didn't want to frighten me. My first experience was being woken up at around 3 a.m. At first, I was in a half awake and half sleep mode. What woke me was a very loud noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like the boys were rearranging furniture. Very heavy furniture. Loud scraping. So loud that I was sure they were scratching the wooden floors. I instantly became furious and marched upstairs ready to bust some butts. When I got to the top of the stairs though, all was quiet and dark. I started opening bedroom doors, only to find all the boys sleeping soundly. I thought, wow, that was a vivid dream. To my dismay though, it happened a couple of months later and became more and more frequent until it was almost a weekly event. I was speaking about this with my neighbour, and she got a really funny look on her face. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "I don't want to scare you, but when my sister, who's clairvoyant, was over, she looked up at the window, pointing to one of the boys' rooms, and said, 'She has company.' I asked her what she saw, and she said she saw a man and a woman in old-time clothes staring back at her. At some point, I decided I want to share my experience with my sons. When I did, they all broke out with their own stories. Some of them had been touched, some just heard noises, or felt their beds being shaken violently in the middle of the night. Here are a few of the most memorable ones that stand out in my mind. We being myself and around 7 to 9 teenagers filling up every square inch of the living room, were all just visiting and half watching Family Guy. My youngest decides he was tired and going up to bed. Away he went, only to return a short time later with pale skin and wide eyes. He said he'd gone to his room, closed his bedroom door, and got into the top bunk. That's when he heard the door handle turn, heard the door open, and shut again, and then felt someone sit on the bottom bunk. He figured it was his brother, and leaned over the bunk and yelled something trying to scare him. He said he froze completely when there was no one there. He was completely alone, hence the wide eyes and pale skin. He truly looked like he'd seen a ghost. One morning, I woke up to find my boys and one of their friends all sleeping everywhere in the living room, which wasn't allowed in our house. I woke up my second oldest and asked him what the deal was. He said that they couldn't sleep upstairs because something was opening and closing all the doors at night. He said they'd wake up and prop things in front of the doors to prevent them from slamming, only to be awoken by slamming. He said, "Ma, those ghosts keep moving the stuff we put in front of the doors. We just decided to sleep down here, and I couldn't blame them." My oldest subsequently joined the Marines, and on his month-long furlough after his Iraq tour, he had a very creepy encounter. He said he was lying on his stomach and reading from his laptop when he felt something sit on his bed. He said he looked over and saw an indent of a person sitting there and loudly screamed and ran out the room. He said he looked over and saw an indent of a person sitting there and said out loud, "I hate ghosts," and not a second later, he said he was being pushed into the bed. He spoke the name of Jesus and it quickly got off him. My final straw was on Halloween night of all times. I was at the computer in the dining room home alone, and I felt something behind me. I turned and heard my name being said in an awful low and sinister growly voice, and then the sound of something large falling down the staircase. It was so loud, I thought I'd find a broken dresser at the bottom, and there was nothing. Nowhere. I searched upstairs and outside for the cause of the crash, but nothing. I finally had my pastors and the elders of the church come and bless my property and my house. There have been no strange activities since then. I no longer live in that house, but one of my sons had bought it, and according to him, the house is still clean. Number 6. I live in a haunted house, and have done for around 7 years. The house was 2 stories, the ground level, then the basement level of equal size. In the basement, we had mine and my brother's room, as well as the furnace room and the living room. It started simple. When you would be downstairs, you would hear people running up and down the stairs and walking on the wood floors, and vice versa. After a while in my room and the furnace room, there began to be these tiny black creatures, around 2 feet tall with wide eyes and white teeth, that would move things and play with my toys. In the furnace room, they would rearrange the stacked junk. We used it as a garage, as we couldn't even walk into it very far. If that wasn't bad enough, we began seeing tall human shadow-like figures in a pitch-black room where you can't see your hand in front of your face, but you could see a shadow figure. They started showing up in the yard and trees and didn't really come into the house. Eventually our lives took a turn for the worse, with legal issues regarding my great-grandfather, and he came to live with us. He was never a good man. He beat his wife and kids and stole from everyone he could, but we took care of him all the same. He had his own demon that followed him. But anyway, when he showed up, he slept in the basement living room and regularly prayed for God to kill us because he believed that we were bad people. When he showed up, the shadow figures followed him into the house. They began standing in my doorway at night and watching me, so I would close and lock my door. Unlike the small imp creatures, the shadow people gave off a harmful vibe. Pretty soon, the shadow figure began coming into my room, as well as my brother's room, being their favorite. They never went upstairs or crossed my room doorway. I think it was my cat. However, they did love my brother's room, and they would stand at the end of his bed and watch him sleep. One night, things got much worse than they ever had. My great-grandfather was asleep in his bed, and I decided to put saran wrap over my brother's door to play a trick on him. I spent a bit of time taping up, and when I went to look at my handiwork, there were 3 huge cuts down the middle. So I took it down and tried again, and there they were once more. I decided to give it one more shot, and as I wrapped it up, it began tearing in front of me. And I mean really slowly, like someone was purposefully cutting into it. I decided to wake my brother and show him, and as he walked out of his room, we turned the corner and stood face to face with one of the shadow figures. It was standing in the room with all the lights around it, just turned around to look at us. They had no eyes or face, but you could still feel them looking at you. So we ran into my brother's room to hide. We lay there for a good long while we could hear the other room being thrown around. After a few hours we drifted off and slept through the night. After that, the shadow figures messed with my brother quite often. I believe it was because when we turned the corner, he was in front, and he was the one the shadow figures looked at. They began to physically attack him. My brother had a friend over, and my brother took a swing at one of the imps and it disappeared. But when they woke up, they had bruises all up and down their backs. As things got worse, the shadow figures wouldn't let us out of our rooms, and one night, when my brother left his room, one grabbed him and told him to get the hell back in bed, which my brother promptly did. A while after, my brother went to India with my dad on a business trip, whilst we still lived in that haunted house. Whilst there, my brother went into one of the old temples with the door low that forces you to bow to all the gods carved into it. He ended up buying these glass bracelets for my mother and sister at the temple. Nothing happened until he got home though. My brother and dad came home from India, and about a week went by and just the usual stuff happened. However, I started to see a small cat run up and down the stairs. Now, in a house with 3 cats, that wasn't unusual, except that this cat had no body. From what I could see of the cat, was a spinal column and a head, and it all appeared to be made of smoke. Seeing what I'd seen in that house, I didn't think anything of it. Over time though, the cat got aggressive. I couldn't leave my bedroom after a while, and I don't mean that the cat sat outside and wouldn't let me out. When I would go to leave, I would become extremely heavy and tired, and as soon as I left my room, I'd hardly be able to move at all. This only happened at night, so I just passed it off as being too tired to make it past the bathroom. I dropped that theory when my brother began to tell me that the cat would sit on his chest at night and look at him. He said, whilst it was on him, he couldn't move or make a sound at all. I still believe that these things left him alone because of my cat. Once I rescued him, they never came back into the room as long as he was there. We ended up taking the bracelets my brother bought whilst in India and breaking them all. After that, we never did see that cat again. But the shadow figures and the things that followed my great-grandfather were still in the house. My mother believed us when we told her that all these things were in the basement and that we'd experienced them a lot. She told me that so had she. My dad, however, didn't believe us at all. Not until we were moving and he experienced it firsthand. Like I said before, my grandfather was in no way a good man. He had done so many things to hurt people that it would take me a long time to just list all the things he did. When he came to stay with us, he was 92 years old, but still coherent. However, he couldn't move that well and couldn't reach for anything below his waist, so he had to change his pants, underwear and socks. He would regularly pray for us to be hurt and killed, so it wasn't too unusual to find him talking to himself. He was always afraid of the night though. This was around the time things with the shadow figures were getting bad, and my great-grandfather was telling us that he had this demon following him around, which we just wrote off as him going crazy. Eventually, we would find him laying on the ground outside the bathroom, saying things like, "It pushed me down," or "It's trying to get to me." We just figured the hell, and we took extra precautions to make sure he wouldn't again. We found him there a few more times, and we began to see scratches on his feet, starting at his ankles and running down to his toes, like something was grabbing him. It was odd, because he could never reach for his feet. This was when my dad started to become a little uneasy about the house. Now, we moved out very shortly after this, but due to recent robberies in the neighborhood, we had someone stay at the old house during the day, and one at night whilst we moved everything to the new house. My brother, who was 19 at the time, wanted to stay the night there alone, so my dad was there during the day. My dad said that all day he would hear people talking downstairs, and they would constantly sprint up and down. When he were downstairs, he'd hear them running back up the stairs. Despite that and what happened to my brother, he insisted on staying the night. He was going through a ghost hunting phase. My brother stayed 2 nights in the house, and I honestly could never get him to tell me what happened whilst he was there. But he told me that it was some of the scariest shit he'd ever experienced. He said he thought the shadow figures were angry that we were leaving, and that at night, the house went crazy. We still own the house, and I want to go back and stay the night, but honestly I'm afraid of what might happen. So, when we took in my great-grandfather, he also brought his cat, Angel. She seemed normal enough, and didn't do anything too unusual. Just the normal creepy cat things. With her, we had 2 other cats. There was my brother's cat, Relish, and then my sister's cat, Whiskers. Relish slept in my brother's room, but when things started getting crazy, he would look up at the ceiling and howl all night, and eventually he would not come downstairs anymore, which was good because he peed on things. Whiskers slept upstairs or outside, so we never saw much of him. Angel was different though. The imp and shadow figures never bothered her or paid her any mind. She always just walked right by them around the basement at night without any fear. I had her in my room for a while, but the more she was in there, the more the things in the basement would come into my room, so I stopped letting her sleep with me. However, shortly after we rescued my cat, they left my room alone, as long as he was around. When a bit of time passed, Angel would spend all night in the furnace room, which is where the little imps would stay. I think it may have been because of the heat in the room. Either way, it became nearly impossible to keep her out of there. We never really paid her too much mind, except she would always sit across the room from my great-grandfather and watch him all day. After a while, my great-grandfather left and we had his cat that was tearing up the house, so we had to get rid of her. When we first got her, we drove her up from my great-grandfather's house, which is 5 hours away. She didn't make any noise, never seemed upset. She was always this way on car rides, such as to the vets or when we had to clean the house and take the pets out for the day. She never was bothered by the car. When we took her to give her away, however, she was different. She started just as quietly as normal, but once she got into the car, she began screaming at the top of her lungs. We thought she was just afraid of the car and kept going and going, and then she began shaking her crate so violently that the car shook. Once she began shaking, she stopped screaming and growled in the deepest, most threatening way I've ever heard. I've grown up with cats and know how they sound when they're scared or on the attack. But this was nothing like I've ever heard. My brother and I pulled over and were so terrified by this cat and not knowing what to do that we began to pray out loud. I didn't know what to say, so I just asked for protection. What was odd was the movement. I finished the prayer and Angel went quiet. The car stopped shaking and the cat wasn't making any more noise. The look in her eyes went from aggressive to the calm look it normally was. As we kept going, every time Angel began to shake and growl, I would recite the same prayer to myself and it would stop for a while. I'd like to think she was just frightened, but honestly I can't help but feel there was something wrong with her to this day. She never did seem right, but that was far from unusual. In conclusion, after moving away, we were a lot happier and everything was a lot calmer and tranquil. I hope for the next residents of the house, for their sakes, that whatever malicious entities still reside there get bored and leave. Number 7. I recently watched The Babadook, and the closure reminded me of my own experiences when I had to deal with depression myself. All of this happened when I was 12 to 16 years old. I am now 25 and haven't felt a spirit ever since I felt better. My mother and I used to live in a 3-story apartment. The upper floor was basically my own, with my room, a bathroom and a tiny hallway. I think it all started with my mum asking me where I can put certain things. She couldn't find documents that had been in the living room before, or small things such as pens. Naturally, she blamed me, but when things that belonged to me went missing, she no longer believed that I had hidden them. Apart from this, the television turned itself off and on a couple of times. However, none of this makes you think, shit, this apartment is haunted, so we weren't too worried. Around 1 year later, when I was 13, my depression got a bit worse, and things in our apartment got weirder. I was asleep, but awoke abruptly, only to start crying. I suddenly felt someone petting my cheek, the way you do when babies are crying. I immediately felt comforted and fell back asleep. I remember when I had one of my friends over, we stood in my floor hallway and heard somebody running the stairs up and down. My friend got pale and was genuinely shocked, as was I. A couple of days later, I was home alone and spending some time in my room. The door was open, and I heard someone unlocking our apartment front door, opening it, and then closing it. I then heard someone walking up the stairs and called out for my mum, and I assumed that she'd gotten home early. But when I went to peek to check when she didn't reply, there was no one there. To this day, I am absolutely sure that I even heard the key in the lock. I felt as if I were being watched quite often. It actually got to the point where it was so normal that I got used to it. My mum also said that she saw things move from the corner of her eye, and that she felt as if somebody was there with her sometimes, even when she was alone. Those occurrences happened now and then, but luckily, it didn't scare us too often. We kind of got used to it, and the ghost or whatever didn't do any harm. Then at age 14 or 15, my depression got so bad, I started cutting and tried to commit suicide twice. During this time, my mum told me she saw a white fog walking up to my door. I was a bit scared, but what was I supposed to do about it? Then an incident happened, which really convinced me that our apartment was genuinely haunted. I was in bed trying to sleep, but couldn't, as I wasn't really tired. Out of nowhere, I heard a heavy breathing coming from my couch, which was right across from my bed. Maybe some of you have seen the others. There's a scene at the end when you can hear the old lady breathing. It sounded like this, but more evil. At first I thought I was imagining it, but I was so shocked and frightened that I couldn't fall asleep, and stayed awake for another couple of hours. The breathing never stopped during that time. When I finally had the guts to stand up and just get out of my room. When I passed the couch, the breathing got quieter, but very loud once I was in the hallway. Luckily, my mum believed me and let me sleep in her room. She checked my room, but there was nobody there. Still, she also heard the breathing. I heard it again a couple of times during the day and at night. Aside from that, I saw flashes of light every day, no matter the time and weather. I read that seeing flashes of light can be a sign of a migraine, but gladly I never had serious headaches. Besides, I didn't see those flashes right before my eyes, but outside my windows. To this day, I am convinced that the apartment was haunted, and as weird as it may sound, I believe that my depression basically summoned something. However, I still can't explain the flashes. So if anyone has an explanation, or has felt something similar, I'd love to know. Number 8. When I was 13, I experienced the ghost of my grandmother. She died in her sleep whilst taking a nap on the living room couch. Afterwards, according to my father and grandfather, every now and again, they could hear her make the trip from the bedroom to the kitchen and open the refrigerator door. A trip she made many times when she was alive. At first, I thought my father and grandfather were making this up, having fun at my expense. A couple years after she passed away, my father and I went to spend the weekend with my grandfather. My father and I slept on the living room couch, as it opened into a double bed, the same couch my grandmother died on. My grandfather left the house to go to a next-door neighbor's house to play poker. My father and I went to bed in the living room, and my father went right to sleep. I, however, laid awake, reading a magazine. After a while, I heard the noise of the back bedroom door being pulled open. I heard the sound of shuffling feet, and I heard the creak in the floor directly in front of the bathroom doorway. I hear more shuffling feet. Then I hear the fridge door being pulled open, and I hear the sounds of glass bottles in the fridge door clinking against each other. Feeling thirsty, I decide to get out of bed and join my grandfather in the kitchen for a cold drink. I go into the kitchen, only to find I'm alone, by myself. I was puzzled. I could have sworn I heard my grandfather walk from the bedroom into the kitchen and open the fridge. It was at that moment that I remembered that my grandfather wasn't home. He was over at the neighbor's house, and he hadn't come back yet. Then I remembered my grandfather and father's ghost stories. And then I got scared. I raced from the kitchen into the living room and leaped over my sleeping father into my side of the bed. Then I went to sleep. I don't know how long I slept for before I woke, but I felt a feeling of paralyzing fear in my body. I was frozen. I was lying on my right side, and it took me a while to work up the courage to turn my head to the left. My head was covered by a blanket. There was a shadow being cast onto my blanket. The shadow was the outline of a head and the shoulders of a woman with a beehive hairdo. My grandmother used to always have a beehive hairdo, even years after it went out of style, up until she died. I heard heavy breathing coming from the shadow. I had to work up the courage to move one of my hands to remove the blanket off my face, and when I did, in an instant, the paralyzing fear I felt was gone. The shadow was gone, the sounds of heavy breathing was gone. My father was still sleeping. I pulled the blanket back over my head and went back to sleep, only to wake up on my right side, and the paralyzing fear was back. I forced my head to turn. The shadow was back. The heavy breathing was back, and again I summoned up all my courage to move my hand and take my blanket off my face, only to find that there is nothing there, and the feeling is again gone. I went through this same routine the entire night. I lost count of how many times it happened, maybe a dozen, maybe more, but it happened a lot. The next morning I told my father what happened to me throughout the entire night as he slept. The sound of the bedroom door opening, the shuffling of feet, the fridge door opening, nobody in the kitchen, being awakened with paralyzing fear, the shadow, the heavy breathing, and the repeat performances throughout the night. I kind of expected him to tell me that I was just seeing and hearing things, but instead, he just smiled and exclaimed, "That was Grandma." Number 9. I was home alone with my grandmother. I was her caretaker. She had a serious stroke a few months before that left her paralyzed on one side and unable to communicate verbally. It was Easter, and my mother and aunt had thrown a dinner and both gone out, leaving a huge mess. It was about midnight by then, and I was bone tired and just started cleaning after putting my nana to bed. Now, the past week or so, she'd been doing something new. Sometimes, when we put her to bed, she'd start screaming, just a few minutes after the lights had been put out. And when I'd go in, she'd be sobbing and pulling her hair in fear. Since she couldn't talk, I'd have to ask her lots of yes-no questions for her to nod at. But I was at a loss as how to guide the conversation. All she could indicate so far was through pointing that there was something up in the back upper corner of the room scaring her. No matter what I did, whether it would be reaching for a photograph that had some relation to her dead parents, or kissing a crucifix, nothing seemed to settle her. But tonight she was quiet, so I started on the living room, and I was straightening to put away the stack of towels that belonged in the kitchen. And then I heard voices, men's voices so clearly, I instantly assumed that with the remote, which I had just put away, I'd somehow turned on the TV in a dead-bolted room on the far side of the kitchen. So I picked it up and pressed power. Nothing. I walked a few steps closer to the bathroom, built off the kitchen in such an old house, and I had this pricking sensation. I used to get it a lot as a kid, but ignored it, and the voices somehow faded against the sound of the water pipes. Well, okay, I told myself. I was just overtired. I turned back for the towels, and when I came back, I saw it. These papers on the floor that a moment before were on the table. I was confused. Maybe I was just tired. I placed them and went back to get some dishes. And as I passed the bathroom, I saw a small man in a hat dancing in there. By now I was bullshit, but damn if those dishes didn't need doing. So I shut the bathroom door and brought them in. TV cable on the kitchen floor from the dead-bolted room, right in the middle for me to see. I put it on the table and started scrubbing the dishes. No sir, I was just tired. No ghosts or demons here. I was humming to show how in control and unconcerned I was, scrubbing up to the last casserole dish, when I heard 3 loud knocks on the sink bottom. Like something was crouched in the cabinet underneath and rapping on it with its knuckles. I picked up the dish and dropped it experimentally to see if it would cause an echo. I'd just dropped it in a moment before, and there was silence. So I just went back to scrubbing, a little more subdued this time. The cabinet door then swung out, deliberately hitting my knees twice, with a little pause between both. Forget the dishes. I dropped that stupid thing, went back into the living room and repeated the Lord's Prayer until the prickly feeling left all of a sudden. My nana's room was on the far side of the living room, and I did not want that thing anywhere near her. She never screamed at night either. Number 10. When I was a child, I wanted to believe ghosts were real. I wanted to desperately prove that. For many years I tried, but to no avail. Until I turned 18. By then I did believe that some things couldn't be explained, and was slowly losing hope. But in an aviary that had lovebirds, cockatiels and budgies, equaling to about 500 in total, anyone who has dealt with small breeding parrots understands that some parents aren't good to their chicks and will abandon and abuse them. Of course, the parents were kept more as pets and were not allowed to breed, and so I would become the new mum, Take into consideration that feeding chicks is a lot like feeding a human baby. They want to be fed even at night, in 2 to 4 hour intervals. One night, I was laying in bed and had said my pleasantries to my friends for the night. In my silence, I was recollecting some memories, and my silence broke. I heard an odd gurgling sound. I figured it was the little water bottle I kept for my little fledglings, and thought nothing much. Dead silence followed through the room, and I began to become a little alert from the oddness of it all. Again, the queer quietness was stolen. The sound was akin to gurgling or croaking, and I have no idea how to describe it really. It just made my body go into fight or flight mode, and my hair stood on end. Honestly, it sounds like a cliche reaction, but it's true. I looked around and saw nothing. I decided my next course of action was to ask if anything was in the room. My little birds squeaked tiredly back, but nothing was seen or heard. I decided to take the next step and slam my foot against the bed. To my horror, I felt a force shove against my bed 4 seconds later. I was astounded and in shock, and nothing happened after that. 2 weeks later, I was walking into the kitchen and went to the fridge. Before I opened the door, that same noise was heard not 2 inches from my face. I don't remember grabbing anything from the fridge, but I do remember walking back to my room calmly, where I noped for the rest of the night. A month later, in the middle of the day, I was talking to my friend on Skype, and the door to my bedroom started shaking violently, and I screamed at my brother to stop it. He yelled from the bedroom that it wasn't him, and I quickly opened the door. Nothing. How my fat-ass brother could silently run to the living room in a second is beyond me. I can't explain it. I'm pretty sure my friend pooped his pants on the other end, and I was happy that something happened in front of someone and that I couldn't explain it. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I really liked this topic, and hope you did as well. There's nothing quite as terrifying as a haunted house. My brother, over on his channel History Profiles, just released a video on the Norse god Odin. It's a really interesting video. It would mean a lot to me if you could check it out. Link can be found on screen now or in the description. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.